You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
A mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand.
Today we have Edwin Vieira, Dr. Edwin Vieira, who is a constitutional attorney who has argued a number of cases before the United States Supreme Court. He's written, I think, about close to a dozen books over the years, and he covers just about every area of the Constitution that you can think of. And I can't think of a better person to be talking about the battle ahead. And that battle ahead is preserving the right to keep and bear arms, because the state of Virginia and the state of Washington, among others, are starting to show their true colors. Liberal, progressive politicians in those states have done a number on the citizens of their state, and they really do need to be taken care of. And Edwin, I see that you're on. Welcome to the radio program. I look forward to hearing your opinions, your ideas about what's going on in Virginia and also in Washington and other states around the country. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Dan.
We're talking about the battle ahead. Of course, I first met Edwin, a lot of years ago when you helped us with the Sound Money bill in Montana, and I have to say it's always fascinating talking to you, because you're such a bright man. I mean, it's fun to be part of a discussion, and you've written a number of books on the well-regulated militia, the Second Amendment, things that are right now in the focus of average Americans. And I want to give you the opportunity to talk about what's going on in Virginia, and then some ideas that you might have.
Okay. Well, the history is pretty straightforward. Mr. Bloomberg came into Virginia with about $2.5 million, funding his gun control agenda through various anti-gun groups, transmission belts, and so forth. And they were very clever in that they targeted specific legislative districts that they thought they could turn Democratic, and were successful sufficiently so that they gained control of both the House of Delegates and the Senate in the Virginia General Assembly. Well, they already had the governor and the lieutenant governor and the attorney general, so now they have everything they need to enact essentially whatever form of gun control they think they can get away with. And since the election, there have been pre-filed in November and December various bills that make it fairly clear that they have a pretty extreme agenda. Some of them are as simple-minded as you can only buy 2 handguns a month, or the ubiquitous background check at gun shows, but then they spiral up or escalate to actual prohibition of what they call assault firearms that are now legally possessed by Virginians. So it's a pretty broad spectrum of gun control initiatives, kind of thing you'd expect out of Bloomberg, what he's been promoting ever since he was mayor of New York and maybe before that. Of course, the problem here is that on the other side, problem for the Democrats on the other side, is that a movement to create Second Amendment sanctuary jurisdictions took hold very quickly. And they have something over 100 of the counties and towns here in Virginia in which the Board of Supervisors, Town Council, whatever it may be, the local jurisdictional governing body, has signed on to a Second Amendment sanctuary resolution, which essentially says that they will not enforce or execute or be parties to the effectuation, different language, of any unconstitutional gun control bills coming out of Richmond, the capital of Virginia, or some of them also include coming out of Congress. But obviously the immediate threat is coming out of Richmond. So the Democrats have been moving ahead fairly quickly in anticipation of January the 20th, which the pro-gun people here call Lobby Day. They all go down to the Capitol and confront their state legislators on any gun control bills that may be imminent. And this year is going to be, from what I understand, a really tremendous meeting. But, you know, in the long run, they can lobby all they want, they can talk all they want, but the Democrats in favor of gun control have the majority. So we'll just have to see what it is they enact, and then we'll have to see how they intend to enforce it. As soon as these Second Amendment sanctuary resolutions started coming out, the governor and others began talking about, well, you know, we might take funds away from these local jurisdictions who don't enforce these laws. We might send in the National Guard. I mean, that's how extreme they've been in terms of the kind of in terrorem rhetoric that's coming out of Richmond. But I think they have to think twice, because it's obvious with the number of local jurisdictions. And remember, this is not simply individuals who have signed some kind of petition. The individuals went to their local jurisdictional bodies, their boards of supervisors, their town councils, and had them sign on to very specific resolutions dealing with this sanctuary concept. So what we have here is a direct clash between local government and the state government, and we'll see the extent to which perhaps the federal government, in particular Mr. Trump, can become involved in it. Now, looking at a number of these bills, really, some of them, in a sense, are innocuous. They've had them before, the 2 handgun a month limitation. I remember when that was already in, and then it was repealed when the Republicans took over. Now it's coming back. I doubt that really affected people to any great extent. I can't imagine that it was a vital concept to buy more than 2 handguns a month. Now, you'll say, all right, it violates Second Amendment anyway, but let's look at the actual bills that they want to get passed, which limit or prohibit what they call high-capacity magazines, which limit or prohibit or require people to obtain permits for what they call assault firearms. And the assault firearms bill is a fascinating one, because not only does it cover every semi-automatic rifle with a detachable magazine that fits the AR-15 pattern and maybe the AK-47 pattern and a lot of other patterns, but it also covers various parts. So if you have a muzzle brake or a folding stock or a grip for one of those rifles, but you don't have the rifle, maybe you never had the rifle, but you have that part, they treat that part as an assault firearm, and you would be covered by whatever the penalties are in the different versions of the statute for having that part, especially if they ban assault firearms entirely. They make it a Class 6 felony, which is a serious matter. So that's where they're going. And what interests me about this is the typical response that we're getting out of the pro-Second Amendment people Right. They're going to attack these bills on the basis that they can't do what they say they'll do. You know, statistics prove this, statistics prove that. The Heller case said that people have a right to protect themselves with handguns and so forth and so on. The ultimate agenda here is quite a bit different. I mean, what these Democrats are doing is an attempt to overturn a fundamental structural component of our entire constitutional system. If you read the Second Amendment, well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, just stop right there and try to think what that means. Well, go to the words a free state. And it's interesting that in the German language, the word Freistaat has two components, free state. But it is usually translated as republic. A Freistaat in German is a republic. And I would say that that's pretty much the idea that the framers of our Constitution have, because there is a provision in the Constitution dealing with a republican form of government. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, Article 4, Section 4. Right? So putting those two together, you would say, all right, what is a republican government? And if you go through the literature of the founders, at least, a republican form of government has two components, one of which is the people have all the sovereignty. Sovereignty is in the people themselves. And then the people choose representatives to deal with the problems of government because democracy is too cumbersome. We can't operate a large society on the basis of New England town meetings. You can't get everyone together to vote on national issues. So it's those two elements, sovereignty in the people and the people calling upon representatives who will then represent the people in terms of the issues that may come before their state government or their national government. Well, if you attack the well-regulated militia that is the necessary security for a free state, what are you attacking? You're attacking a republican form of government. That's what's going on here. This is an attempt to overthrow the entire structure. Right? I don't know that all of the gun control proponents understand this. I mean, a lot of these people are emotionally driven. They're dupes. They're what Lenin would call useful idiots. They don't really know what they're doing in the long run. They're just signing on because there's an immediate emotional or political satisfaction they get from saying that they're going to prohibit what the Attorney General of Virginia calls gun violence prevention measures. This is what they're after, gun violence prevention measures. And they don't understand the long-term consequences. For them, there are no consequences, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that the Bloombergs of this world, the ones who can spend $2.5 million, which is what he spent coming into Virginia, carpetbagger, to fix this election, they know what they're doing. They understand perfectly well that that they don't want to leave sovereignty in the hands of the people. And the only way to guarantee that that sovereignty is going to be removed from the hands of the people is take away what the Constitution says is necessary to the security of a free state, what is necessary to the security of a republican form of government, which is having the great mass of people, what the Virginia Constitution calls the body of the people, trained to arms in a well-regulated militia. And they're going after that too. They're going after training. They're going after gun ranges. You go down the list of this, it looks like it was written by someone who really understands the Constitution of the United States, but wants to overturn it.
Right. Well, and you know probably better than any that the radical left, the radical progressives have learned how to chip away one little piece at a time. They'll take one little thing, and if they put a lot of pressure on something and they feel resistance, then they'll take that little piece that they get and kind of back off for a time, and then they'll be right back at it again. And, you know, through this incrementalism, they've figured out how to destroy the freedoms that we have. Isn't that right?
Oh, I think so, but that's only when they sense or receive resistance. See, I think when the Democrats won the election last year, and remember, Virginia goes on odd years, so it was an odd year. We had our legislative election. When they won that, they thought, well, we're in the catbird seat now. We can just move right ahead and do essentially anything we want. We have the governor, we have the legislature, we probably have the courts on our side too. We'll just ram this stuff down the throats of the deplorables, as Hillary Clinton categorizes people. And then what happened, which no one had foreseen, the Second Amendment sanctuary movement sprang up like dragon's teeth out of the ground, if you remember the Greek myth. Right? And the Democrats had to take a look at that and say, uh-oh, we have awakened a sleeping giant. Now we have to be very careful with what we're going to do. And that brings your point up again, Dan, incrementalism. They've thrown out some of these extreme bills. We're going to ban all assault firearms. If you have assault firearm, or a part for that matter, you're going to be convicted of a felony. And then when the time comes, they'll back off slightly from that. They'll back off first to the position, well, all we want you people to do is to register those. And there's a statute that has a provision. You can keep your assault firearm if you get a permit from the state police, which of course will then have you on record. So 2 or 3 years from now, they can come back and confiscate those firearms, right? So that'll be the game they'll play in the legislature, right? Extreme position presented, fallback position, which doesn't quite as badly eviscerate the Second Amendment. And some of these pro-gun people will say, oh, thank goodness they didn't at least ban the assault rifle. I can keep my assault rifle as long as I get a permit from the state police. Just fill out a form, right? And they'll go along with that. Instead of doing what they ought to do, which is follow Nancy Reagan's advice when it came to drugs and alcohol, which of course is a problem we have. Gun control is a political drug. What did Nancy Reagan say? Just say no. We want to give them nothing. Everything was fine in this state with the gun statutes that we had. Some of them should have been repealed. Maybe they went too far. Maybe they were unnecessary, whatever. There are all sorts of arguments for reform of the statutes we had. That was fine. We don't need to add anything more. And that should be the position these people take. And I am waiting for the NRA in particular to enunciate that position, because they are the compromisers of compromisers. They compromised on the totally illegal bump stock ban. They compromised on these red flag provisions, and we have one of those in the bills now being put up in Virginia. Probably, I just read it yesterday. On a cursory reading, it probably has 6 or 7 plainly unconstitutional provisions in it. It violates First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, 14th Amendment. I mean, there's no problem in terms of making constitutional arguments against this thing. But the average person who doesn't know says, oh, well, that sounds like a wonderful idea. And what did Mr. Trump say? Take the guns first, give the due process later. Right? Now, he's backed off from that position. I guess he realized that there was a significant amount of negative feedback coming to him. But that doesn't mean that these bills are not being proposed, not just in Virginia. I mean, they're being proposed all over the country. New Hampshire had a proposal. Live free and die is the motto of that state. And there's a red flag proposal up there. Now, too many people apparently from Massachusetts relocating to New Hampshire. So it's going to be a long legislative struggle. In Virginia, we have the peculiarity that a law may be, I say in quotes, a law may be enacted and signed by the governor, but they don't take effect until July. So we may see a bill pass, and there'll be a long period of time, a couple of months at least, until that bill becomes effective. And during that period of time, I suppose we're going to see people starting to gin up court cases, figure out some way to bring the judiciary into this. Difficulty in Virginia is a few years back, Maryland passed an assault firearms legislation. It wasn't as bad, or isn't as bad, as some of these things proposed in Virginia, but it's bad enough. And it went through the Maryland District Court, United States District Court, and then up to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals is the one that has jurisdiction over Maryland, West Virginia, Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina. Right? So Virginia is under the umbrella of that particular court. And the Fourth Circuit decided a case called Colby versus Hogan, which upheld all of the provisions of the Maryland assault firearm statute. So that's now the controlling case within Virginia as far as the federal courts are concerned. And I would think that most state court judges, seeing this essentially federal issue, because it's a Second Amendment issue, dropped on their desks, would probably say, well, the easy way out for me is just to follow the lead of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. Right? It decided it this way. I can do the same thing. These statutes here in Virginia read very much like the one in Maryland. Maybe some of them go a little bit further, and I'll finesse that in some way. And I'll get this case out of my court and up into the appeals court, and let's see what happens. And then you're talking about years, because in Virginia, you go from the circuit court to the Intermediate Court of Appeals, to the Supreme Court of Virginia, and then maybe to the Supreme Court of the United States. So you're talking 2, 3, 4, 5 years at a minimum before it gets up there. And even if it went through the federal system, you'd go to a district court, and then you'd go to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's a couple of years at a minimum right there. And then you sit around for some number of months till you go to the Supreme Court. So you could see a situation where they'd pass a piece of legislation like this, say, prohibiting the possession of assault firearms. They have to be sold out of the state, they have to be moved out of the state, or they have to be surrendered or destroyed. And people are now subject to that law. They can't get an injunction against the enforcement of the law pending litigation. The litigation goes on for 3 or 4 years, and during that 3 or 4 years, those people who possess those rifles either have to get rid of them, or have to turn them in, or have to destroy them. And you look at the way some of these statutes read, the government is not going to, the Virginia government is not going to be responsible for any financial losses that these people may suffer as a result of this legislation, even if it turns out that it's unconstitutional.
Right. Well, and isn't the Fourth District Court, isn't that a pretty liberal court? I mean, a very liberal court. So any judgment that you're going to get from them is going to be pretty, well, let's say pretty anti-Second Amendment anyway, isn't it?
Well, it proved to be in this Colby case. That was finally decided en banc, as they say, which is all the judges in the circuit court sat on it. And there were 14 of them, and they ruled 10-4 in favor of the Maryland assault firearms ban. Now, I can't believe that they're going to overturn their own previous decision in the next year or two, assuming that we had some litigation come up. They'll probably follow that. And as a result, the lower court, the district court, and we have 2 in Virginia, Eastern District of Virginia, Western District of Virginia, either one of those is simply going to say, well, we're going to follow the Colby case because the Colby case decided this. That's the precedent. If we were to go against it, we probably would be reversed. So we're going to go along with it. Then gets appealed to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals to a 3-judge panel. And the 3 judges will say, well, we're bound by what the en banc determination was. Same principle, assault firearm defined similarly, whatever the regulation restriction is, that's the end of it. Now, the unfortunate thing was that when the Colby case was decided, Colby, the complainant, filed a petition for writ of certiorari with the Supreme Court. And I cannot understand why the Supreme Court did not take that case, because Colby was a direct contradiction of the Heller case. Absolutely. Even in the way that the Fourth Circuit described what they were doing, all right? It wasn't something that you had to read between the lines. It was right there in black and white. So I don't understand what happened. On the one hand, if the liberals thought that they could uphold the Colby case, they had 4 votes at the time. If the conservatives thought that they could overturn the Colby case, they had 4 votes at the time. They still had Justice Kennedy in the middle then, all right? And the rule in the Supreme Court is if any 4 justices agree to take a petition for certiorari, the case is taken. That doesn't mean it's decided one way or the other. It's just taken. You might have 2 of those coming out one way and the other 2 of those coming out the other way. But if you get any 4, the case has to be heard. So I wonder why they couldn't get 4 on one side or the other, or 2 liberals or 2 conservatives, some mix and match combination to get that case up there, but they didn't. And there's the real problem, because it looks as if until the Supreme Court intervenes, Maryland, West Virginia, Virginia, and the 2 Carolinas are going to be subject to this Colby decision, which for all intents and purposes will rubber stamp most everything that these people in the Virginia legislature have on their wish list.
Right.
Maybe there are some couple of things here and there that are, I think the red flag law, that the one they have now is so bad that one might not go. But most of this gun control legislation fits the pattern that we've seen over in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Maryland. You run down the East Coast, and now we're here in Virginia, right? And of course, D.C., but we'll leave D.C. out for the moment. Fits that pattern. So I can't see why it wouldn't be, number 1, enacted, and number 2, sustained.
If I can join in, if I might.
Sure, Thumper, come on in.
How you doing? Good to see you, Edwin. We're having the same problem here in Washington State. You probably heard what's going on out here. They've been chipping away at our Second Amendment rights out here quite handily for the past several years. And right now, with the state legislature getting fired up for 2020, they've got the laundry list for everything else that they haven't gotten so far is already included in a new bill that's going to be discussed. What's happening in your state there in Virginia, Edwin, is basically everything that they have been wanting to get out of Washington State. Haven't gotten all of it, but then they put it on steroids when they just wrote in all that stuff that luckily you have a lot of sheriffs there that are standing up against it, saying that it won't be enforced in their counties. We have a few sheriffs here in Washington State that are that have done that, but as you know, it's more or less lipstick on the pig as far as being able to really be lawful according to state laws and things like that. Other than the fact that the sheriffs need to stand up and uphold their constitutional duties as far as these laws are concerned. So we're seeing a huge push against the Second Amendment, that's for sure. And do you see anything as far as what President Trump is doing that is anything that may be helpful in all of this?
Well, not yet. Because one of the problems in this situation is you have to see not what they're proposing, but what they enact.
Correct.
All right. And see how far it goes and how they intend to enforce it. And all of these local jurisdictions, actually, we have an attorney general's opinion. Mr. Herring, the attorney general, wrote an opinion saying, well, these Second Amendment sanctuary resolutions really have no effect because state law determines the law on which the local jurisdictions operate. And so if we pass a law dealing with gun violence prevention, then the local jurisdictions are bound simply as a matter of the state law to enforce it or effectuate it in whatever way would be necessary. I'm not, let me put it this way. I wonder when the last time Mr. Herring read the Constitution of the United States was. Mm-hmm. Right. Was that when he went to law school and then he forgot it after the first year or whatever? Because Article 6, Clause 3 of the federal Constitution mandates an oath or affirmation from all state officials, legislators, executive officials, judges, wherever they may be in the state system. They're required to take an oath to support the Constitution, not necessarily to support state legislation or executive orders or judicial opinions coming out of the state courts, but to support the United States Constitution. So those local officials have the ability to stand on that oath of office and then in some way, and there are various suggestions that could be made, to petition the government of the United States to intervene in this matter. I always like to laugh and chuckle a little bit when I hear someone, and maybe it wasn't Governor Northam himself, maybe it was somebody else, I think Northam said it, that he could call out the National Guard. Mm-hmm. Well, who is his superior officer in the National Guard? It's Trump, mm-hmm. right? Trump is the commander-in-chief of the militia of the several states when called in the actual service of the United States, and part of the militia of the United States by statute is the National Guard. So if I were Northam, I wouldn't be too sure about how far my authority would go in that particular body. So there's all sorts of potential here for a kind of interposition situation where first the localities engage in interposition on the basis that these local officers have taken an oath to the Constitution and they don't intend to violate that oath. And then they seek some kind of redress from the government in Washington, in particular, Mr. Trump, because he's in the right position to do it. And the people in the middle, of course, Mr. Northam and the General Assembly in Virginia, suddenly find themselves squeezed between Article 6 and the powers of the President of the United States. I think that would be a fascinating situation to arise, because that situation could arise in every state in this country where there were local officials, whether they'd be city councilors, supervisors of county boards, sheriffs, for instance. Any of those people would be in exactly the same position that the ones are in Virginia today if they simply put on the line that they were not going to violate their Article 6, Clause 3, United States constitutional oath.
Yeah, actually, I believe it was your Representative Donald McEachin was the individual who in the state there threatened that the governor may pull out the National Guard in order to enforce, force the sheriffs to.
Well, he should remember what happened to Orville Forbes back when was that, 57, 58, 1957, 58, when they were having brouhaha in Arkansas over desegregating schools. And Forbes was in favor of maintaining the segregation system that they had. And he was threatening, or maybe actually did call out the National Guard in order to enforce that. And President Eisenhower came in and he, quote unquote, nationalized the National Guard, took that right away from Forbes. I think something similar to that happened with in Mississippi with what's his name there, the governor that ran for president, Wallace, George Wallace. I think there was a similar situation that Wallace was threatening. It might have been Kennedy or it might have been Johnson, whatever. But we've seen that before. So, I mean, if I were in Northam's shoes and I'm looking across the river at this fellow who I can anticipate would be a highly motivated antagonist on this issue, I would be treading lightly when I was talking about National Guard or sending state police or whatever down there to enforce these laws when they're passed. Probably his most effective method would be the one they threatened, to somehow to cut off funding to the local jurisdictions that don't perform this, that, or the other thing. But they probably need some special legislation to do that, because I'm not sure how they would enforce some of these things in the local jurisdictions except through the sheriffs or the local police, right? If you're going after someone who hasn't registered his assault firearm, the next step, of course, is to get a warrant, go into the house, seize the firearm, then charge the man with violation of the statute. That would be the sequence. Well, who's going to do that? It would be the local law enforcement people initially. And if they refuse, well, maybe Northam would send the state police as the next step. So there's a whole series of escalations in here, and we can't really predict which ones will occur because we don't know what the statutes are going to say, other than they're not going to be good.
Well, and Edwin, one of the things that you're aware of is the fact that so many of these county and local officials, the mere threat of having the money trough pulled out from under them make them very ineffective and make them not act. So I think that's what's happened in the past, is just the threat was enough to silence a lot of these things. But I don't think it's going to happen this time. We're getting too close to the edge of losing this country. As you mentioned earlier, we lose the Second Amendment, we lose every other amendment, we lose the whole Constitution.
And there are too many of them for the scenario of cowardice. If you only had half a dozen of these scattered around the state, then you might be able to predict, well, yes, they won't do anything. But you have over 100 and something of these counties. So some of them will do something. Some of them are going to stand up. I suppose the ultimate difficulty is, well, where will they get the lawyers to defend them in these cases? Positively or negatively, I can imagine some situations where the county officials could bring the lawsuit, and then there would be situations where a lawsuit might be brought against them. And that's the grave difficulty, because most of the county attorneys around Virginia probably do not have the level of expertise in the federal constitutional questions that would be necessary to take on people coming out of Richmond.
Well, that's always been an area that's been a problem, and that is people unifying, people coming together to work together. And that's always been a problem with conservatives, much more so than liberals, because, we tend to be very independent. And all these little counties around, if you look at the electoral map of the United States at the last presidential election, the blue counties that are there and the red counties. And the red counties by geographic area are about, I don't know, probably 15, 20 to 1 compared to the blue counties. But the blue counties are all the big population centers. If we could get our county officials, if we could get our local officials to come together, we have far and away the largest part of the country under conservative control.
Oh, that's right. And there's the problem, is organization. The liberals have developed and fine-tuned, honed to a sharp edge their ability to organize, their ability to get out propaganda, to get funding to the right places, to figure what districts they have to go to and what districts they can leave alone, all of those electoral strategies and propagandistic strategies. And they have a lot of big money people behind them. The very fact that Mr. Bloomberg came into Virginia, $2.5 million of expenditures. National Rifle Association, it was about 300,000, maybe a little less, I can't remember. But it didn't compare with what Bloomberg did. And Bloomberg, or his people, very carefully focused their attentions on specific districts because they had some sort of calculation. If we can win here, here, and here, we can take over the legislature. And that's all they needed, a few votes to take over the legislature. All the committee heads change and everything else. Right? And they accomplished that. Meanwhile, the NRA was basically sending out what it always sends out. It's candidate surveys, the thing I received. It's a piece of cardboard, multicolored, and these are the candidates in your area, and this one's an A, and this one's an F, or whatever it is. I saw that. I said, well, I already knew that. You're not telling me something I didn't know about these people, right? What they didn't do, as far as I could see, was to try to mobilize people across Virginia to deal somehow with this Bloomberg strategy. And as a result of that, many people, basically apathetic, were saying, well, all these years we've retained a Republican majority, a small one, but a Republican majority in the General Assembly. And as long as we have that, it doesn't matter that we have Northam in there, right? Because he's not going to get the legislation, the extreme legislation he wants enacted. And we have Trump as president, right? He's in favor of the Second Amendment, at least he says he is. So we don't have to come out and make a special effort. And they didn't. And that's what happened. You had a relatively small turnout, and the Democrats, in the particular areas where they wanted to emphasize their monetary and propagandistic skills, they came in, they won those elections, and here they are. And now we're playing catch up. Right? It's the bottom of the ninth, and we're behind 10-0. Maybe not that bad. Maybe it's the seventh inning, but whatever. Right? It's the second half of the game, and we're the ones who are significantly behind.
Right. And one of the problems that come with that, Edwin, is the fact that we're always historically very slow to react. The people that really should be doing something are the ones that are always the last to react, and that's an area that we need to change. We've got to be proactive, like the left has been for the last 150 years.
Well, I think that's the lesson that you learned from this Virginia situation. I mean, or let's put it this way: if they haven't learned that lesson, then they're really far gone. Right, here it is. This is what the other side can do because of the ability that they've developed to get money, to put out propaganda, to get people doing whatever they do in electioneering, to get the vote out for these, and to find those candidates, and to find the right people, the ones who are going to toe, in this case, the gun control line 100%. And we have not done that. And so this is the kind of the ultimate wake-up call. What is this? This is Pearl Harbor, right, in a sense, okay? Except we could have predicted this one a lot better than they could have predicted Pearl Harbor. Right? We knew this was happening. Oh, yeah. We knew that Bloomberg was financing these anti-gun groups. They weren't hiding in the woodwork. They were right out front. We knew what these candidates stood for because most of them came right out and said how they were in favor of maybe not as extreme as it was eventually shown in the bills that they've drawn. But you knew if Bloomberg was financing them, this was a New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland Democrat, in sense, as far as gun control is concerned. And our people just stepped back and waited. We won't worry about this. We'll wait and see.
Well, and Edwin, a lot of people, I guess, a lot of people don't realize, but people like George Soros are actually his corporations, the financial assets behind people like him, are now buying some of the manufacturers of firearms. That's the latest little trick, and you kind of wonder what all this. I mean, they've got a plan here, and it seems to be weaving itself together pretty quickly. And I don't know; it's pretty worrisome to me.
Well, that's where we have to get back to the fundamental proposition of those first 13 words in the Second Amendment. What is the Second Amendment really about? Well, the Heller case tells you it's about individual right to protect yourself, your family, and so forth and so on. Oh, okay. I don't mean to be crass, but the Founding Fathers did not go to all the trouble of writing the Second Amendment so that an individual could protect his life against a common criminal. That was a principle that went back in English law to heaven knows when. It's probably a Ninth Amendment principle. It's something that didn't have to be stated in the Constitution because at that time no one would ever have questioned it. The Second Amendment was written in order to refer back to the militia provisions of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 15 and 16, and Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, to make sure that Congress and the President were going to continue in the correct maintenance of what the Constitution calls the militia of the several states, and therefore that the states would continue that. And most people think the Second Amendment doesn't apply to the states. Of course it does. What militia are you talking about in the Constitution? It was these state institutions. There is no militia of the United States. It's the militia of the several states. And who is supposed to be in these institutions? Well, every able-bodied adult from typically 16 all the way up until you're superannuated. So that might be 55, 60, 65, it depends. In the old days, it was at that level because people had incurable diseases or they had been injured in some way, so they couldn't perform a militia function. Today, you can find people 65, 75 years. I could perform certain militia functions.
Oh, sure, sure.
Okay, of course. And the idea of it is to enlist everyone in a collective effort to defend the Constitution of this country, number one, because without that, what are we? And then to defend the country against whatever enemies may appear, whether from overseas or coming out of the woodwork in New York City or Richmond, Virginia, wherever they may be. Right? And this is the type of organization which the Founding Fathers looked to, because especially in the late 1700s, 73, 74, 75, and 76, it was those organizations that took the stand against, General Gage in the Massachusetts colony in Boston, and John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore, where? In the Commonwealth, well, it wasn't the Commonwealth, the colony of Virginia. We had exactly the same experience that they did in Massachusetts, except there wasn't a firefight. They scared Murray, and he left. He went on to a British frigate in Chesapeake Bay, stole a printing press, and he started turning out decrees, which no one followed. But it was exactly the same sequence. It was the people of the colony in the militia who simply stood up to him, thumbed their nose at him, and said, no, we're not going to do what you're telling us to do. Because it offends the rights of Englishmen and the natural rights of essentially all men. So we've seen this before. That was the kind of historical foundation on which the framers built everything else, Constitution of the United States, and then the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment. And we've lost an understanding of that this is not, what's going on in Virginia is not some minor question about, the periphery of gun control so that we're not going to have too many mass shootings or whatever, that kind of argument. No, it is not that. It is who is going to control this country. Are the elitists and their political stooges, the Bloombergs, the Soroses, you run down that list, the Bezoses of this world, are they going to control this country, or are the people of this country going to control this country? It's as simple as that.
Well, and it even a little bit more than that, Edwin, because these people are globalists. So it goes beyond our national borders. They think that, these progressive Marxists from all over the world should control us.
Well, they have to bring us completely into that system. We have always been the thorn You look at World War I. There was the first attempt, League of Nations. What happened? The United States didn't join it. Senate turned down the treaty. World War II, they come up with the United Nations treaty. All right, we joined that, but there's always been a great deal of resistance to it, and there still is, a great deal of superstition, a great deal of refusal to go too far along some of these UN initiatives, global UN initiatives. And so they've been playing another game, North American Union. Let's set up an economic conglomerate in the same way they did initially in Europe. That's another one of their schemes. They've got to move us away from independence into dependence upon this system.
Right.
And who is going to resist that in the final analysis? Well, I think it's the average American. The average American is not going to benefit from becoming part of a global system where multi-billion-dollar corporations tell him what to do, what to eat, what to sleep. No, that's wrong. Those are the people who are going to resist. So what do you have to do with those people? You have to take away from them the means of resisting. Mm-hmm. And you might do that mentally by sending their children into public schools where they're brainwashed or all the way through college, come out as nice little Marxists. Or you might do it the other way by putting the political and economic screws to people, which they're doing by sending jobs to China. Or, in the final analysis, how do you control a slave population? You make sure they can't engage in an insurrection.
Right.
The first principle of slavery is you do not arm the slaves.
Right, exactly.
Right? So that's what we're seeing here. Right? Mm-hmm. And this is exactly the same pattern. Technical details must be different. It's exactly the same pattern that has been followed again and again and again through the 20th century. Let's not even go back to ancient history. Through the 20th century, this was done over and over again. Even in Mexico. Let's not say it wasn't just in Europe. It was in Mexico as well.
Oh, yeah.
So one would think that anyone that has any historical knowledge would look at what's going on now and say, oh, I've seen this before. I read a history book where this happened in whichever countries. And now it's happening here. And they're using the same arguments, the same rhetoric to try to put it across.
Well, and we talked about this the other day. That's why they're destroying library books. They're getting rid of the history that tell people, wait a minute, this has happened before.
That's right. And, of course, they don't teach it in the schools.
Am I coming through?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, that's right. That's absolutely right. Well, we need to understand that these people are deadly serious. They absolutely plan to take down this country, and the only way they can do that really is to take away our right to defend ourselves. Now, there's different forms of defense, but the bottom line, they're afraid of the fact that we have the right to keep and bear arms, and that's why they've targeted that one specifically. And our listeners need to understand that in New York City, the biggest sponsor of anti-gun advertisement in New York City was the Chinese government. Well, guess what? Doesn't it make sense for the Chinese, if they want to destroy America, just get rid of our right to protect ourselves?
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, how do you see this all coming together? How do you see us getting to the point where we start to react in a way that's going to have some real purpose and some real advantage? And how can we start to take a power back that we've allowed to slip away from us?
Well, there's a short story and a long story. In this Virginia situation, I can imagine a scenario in which the local jurisdictions go directly to Mr. Trump and say, here's our problem. We're being told by these people in Richmond to violate our oath under the United States Constitution with specific respect to Second Amendment. And that is going to have an effect, Mr. President, on your ability as commander-in-chief to do various things. I won't go into the details. And we want you now to intervene in this. And here's some statutes that you can use and so forth and so on. And if I were the president of the United States, I would already have Northam on the phone and say, I'm watching this. You pass anything like this, this, and this, and I'm going to do this. And then you better watch out. All right? Just a little quiet. Right? We don't have to no Twitter or anything else. Just on the phone, nice, pleasant conversation. But just understand what I'm going to do. All right, so that's one possibility. That's the short answer. And I don't know if Trump would be willing to go out on that limb, given what's going on with the impeachment and all the rest of this business.
Well, he may not win an election if he doesn't
that's another
start
problem.
Standing up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he better do this before the election comes up, because these bills in Virginia, the bad ones or the good, the not so bad ones, they will be law on the 1st of July. All right, so you're not going to wait until next year, I would hope. Now, the other alternative, the longer story is these local jurisdictions have authority over emergency planning, public education through their school boards. So they can begin right there to start teaching children 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 years of age about this proposition of the first 13 words in the Second Amendment. You know, this isn't something just in the 13th Amendment. There are statutes that deal with this, right? Mm-hmm. Title 10 of the United States Code deals with the militia. Mm-hmm. Title 44 of the Virginia Code deals with the militia in great detail, lots of provisions in there. Right? Where those statutory provisions have fallen down is they have let the militia become essentially moribund. Outside of the people in the National Guard and the little group called the Naval Militia, which is the naval equivalent, the Air National Guard, Army National Guard, and the Naval Militia. Outside of those groups, and they're all volunteers anyway, the vast mass of people in this country do nothing with respect to the militia. They are enrolled in the militia as a matter of the statute, but they do nothing. So we have to change that point of view. We have to say, wait a minute. The reason that we have a lot of the problems in this country is because we don't have direct citizen involvement through these institutions which the Constitution mandates, and mandates for the ultimate good reason that it's going to maintain our Republican form of government and our constitutional system. So we have to have some people coming back to that. That can be done at the local level, not necessarily by creating militias, because we really don't want them to do that, but by doing things through the schools, by doing things through their emergency management programs, by doing things through the sheriff's departments, which can deputize people, create posse comitatus type organizations. Wouldn't want to call those militia because they wouldn't be. They would be sheriff's deputies or whatever the appropriate term would be. But the things that they would begin training and educating people to do would be the foundational aspects of eventually revitalizing the militia. That's not going to happen while Mr. Northam and his crew are in charge of the government in Richmond. So we have to hope that we can get rid of those people. And when we get rid of those people, we can start taking this other step. But to take this other step, we have to gain a lot of support. And I would say, besides support, a little bit of experience at the local level. How do we want to do this? What you would do in a town like Roanoke is not the same thing that you would do in a county like Warren County, where I live, which is semi-rural, right? Depends where you are. So there's a lot of things that need to be worked on simply because the system has been moribund primarily since the early part of the 20th century. So we have to recover a lot of knowledge that's been lost. And then we have to make sure that the up-and-coming generations are very carefully schooled, have instilled in them the principles, Declaration of Independence, Constitution of the United States, go within the Constitution, the specific aspects of it, duty of official to abide by the Constitution, the militia structure, so forth and so on. We go all through all of that. So that by the time they become 16 years of age, which in Virginia is when they are enrolled in the militia, read the statute. 16. Think of all these gun control statutes that say you can't have a gun if you're less than 18. Wait a minute, you're a member of the militia when you're 16. What's the matter with you people? Can't you read your own statutes? What's the matter with you? Well, this is our problem. They can't read the statutes in Richmond, and the average person at the local level doesn't even think about this. That's why we're in the septic tank.
The question that really needs to be asked here is they fully know what the statute is, and they know that they're writing these laws in violation of their own state statutes. You know, the fact that you have the militia. The militia, I believe, is from 18 to 40 is for the federal guidelines on that. And again, here in the state of Washington, they basically, unless you want to go out and buy a slingshot, they've restricted everyone from being able to purchase a firearm until age 21. Mm-hmm. Well, that's obviously outside of the statutes. Mm-hmm. These people, they know They know what the statutes are, and they are in writing these laws, passing these laws, signing them, and putting them out there with the idea that there is force and effect of these things, in complete violation of the state constitutions, the federal constitutions, and numerous regulations and everything that are there to back up what's in our constitutions. So you have to, for me, the question is, what is the game that they're playing? Are they just, is the idea just to stomp all over everything and see how far they can push the American people until we say not only no, but hell no, and seriously mean it?
Well, because, I don't think they ever wanted to come to hell no. Look at the English-speaking countries: Britain, United States, Australia, New Zealand. Right? They all come from the same kind of common law background, historical foundation, and so forth. Gun control, they started it in Britain. They moved it to Australia. They moved it to New Zealand. Every one of these test systems, they worked this all out, and now they're using it all in the United States. Now, I'm willing to say, for purposes of argument, that these individuals know exactly what they're doing, and they're trying to set up a totalitarian Bolshevik-type system in which the average American is going to be ground under the heels of an elitist party structure. And if I believe that as president, then I would have to say to my Department of Justice, you need to prosecute these people for criminal violations of civil rights under Title 18 of the United States Code 241 and 242. That's what I would say. And I would have my prosecutors down there be like running sausages out of the Bob Evans sausage factory. The indictments would be coming out so fast, right?
Yeah.
But, and there are some who certainly know. There's no question about that. There are some who certainly understand what they're doing. But a large number of these people, as I say, they're transmission belts, they're useful idiots. They were brought up in the public school system. They went to, colleges controlled by these neo-Marxists. If you ask them to name 3 of the Bill of Rights, they would be unable to do so. How many people have I asked who are supposedly Second Amendment proponents? I would ask, to what provisions in the original Constitution does the Second Amendment relate? And they won't tell me. They don't know. They don't know. And if you read when the Bill of Rights was sent out to the states to ratify, it had a preamble. And the preamble said, we are adopting, and we want you to adopt this set of articles to prevent misconstruction or abuse of the Constitution. Misconstruction or abuse. And misconstruction means, don't understand it. Abuse means you intend to violate it. So that means that every one of those provisions in the Bill of Rights, you could relate back to something in the Constitution that the framers didn't want misconstrued or abused. So if you find the word militia in the Second Amendment, where do you look for in the original Constitution? Militia, right? And you find it there. You wanted to be sure that Congress was going to fulfill its duty to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and that the states would do it if Congress didn't, or the states would do it for purposes which Congress couldn't fulfill. Congress can call forth the militia, execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, repel invasions. That's a pretty good list. But there are a lot of other things that the militia could do in a state context, natural disasters. I mean, think of all these things, right, that wouldn't fall into those 3 constitutional categories. So if you look at this, it's a very nicely, closely knit fabric. All of these things are tied together. And you take any one of those threads out and you start pulling it the way the Bloombergs of the world are doing it, and what happens to the fabric? It unravels, right? The Constitution is not like a bunch of jackstraws, that game that children play, just throw them there and they're randomly there. It's all part of an architectural plan, political architecture, right? Based upon a lot of understanding of human nature, a lot of understanding of political history that the Founding Fathers had, much more so than I would think any politician in my lifetime has ever exhibited. So here we have this structure that was built by a group of highly intelligent and very practical people. And now it's been put in the hands of the Planet of the Apes. Right? It's been put in the hands of these, basically, some are idiots and some are knaves. Right? That's the problem. I don't care which they are.
Mm-hmm.
We have to mobilize the average Americans. The average American is one under the gun. And the average American is the one who's supposed to be exercising the sovereignty. And the average American is the one who's supposed to be a member of the militia. These are the people we have to mobilize. And to be blunt with you, to hell with the rest of those people on the top of the pyramid.
Right.
We'll move them out in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
Huh?
Absolutely. Well, you've touched on something that I think people don't understand, and that is the militia was not just men. It was to be men and women. It's very, very open in that regard. It was also intended to take care of local issues, emergencies, weather, local insurgencies. And the reason that all the states were supposed to have their own militia so they could protect the rights of the people and respond to emergencies within their own states. And then if a national emergency occurred, they would be prepared to go in with other militias from other states and respond to that national emergency.
That's right. And the Constitution specifies that the concept that's important there is Congress calls forth the militia to be employed in the service of the United States. Congress sees some need to call upon the state militias, something we want you to do that fall into one of these three categories of action. We call you forth for those purposes. For everything else, you're a state instrumentality. You do what is needed to protect your own state and your own locality. And of course, historically, that's the way the militia were organized. They were organized from the top down because you had a colonial statute or a state statute, but they were organized at the local jurisdictional level.
Right.
So in New England, it was the towns. In places like Virginia, it was the counties, or maybe the one big city. They had Williamsburg and Norfolk. They had separate militia structures. But that's the way it was formulated because of what? Emergencies always occur someplace. It's always the local people that are first subjects of that emergency. And usually they are the ones not only who are the subject of the emergency, but probably have some idea of how to deal with it because they're on the scene. All right, and they have to move at a relatively rapid pace. They can't wait for some bureaucrat in FEMA in Washington to figure out what to do, right? To send down trailers that have formaldehyde in them or whatever it is that they did when they had the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and they fumbled that one, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a structure we don't have, and it's interesting if one goes back historically, not that far, go back to World War II, just before World War II. The Roosevelt administration, which was trying to get us into the war, of course, recognized that if once we were in the war, millions of servicemen and women, as it turned out, would leave the country. They'd be going to Europe, they'd be going to Asia, whatever. They wouldn't be here in the United States. So what was going to be done about what we now call Homeland Security? What kind of a quote-unquote home guard might we need and might we able to get? So Roosevelt appointed Fiorello LaGuardia and Eleanor Roosevelt to answer that question. And there's an amazing book called Defenseless Under the Night, which covers this. Anyone who wants to read about the incompetence of the federal government in the context of this crisis, read that book. That's enough. Defenseless Under the Night. Well, they didn't accomplish it in the long run because no permanent emergency management structure came out of World War II. But what's interesting, if you read that book, the one thing that they didn't do, they didn't look into the Constitution. They didn't ask the question, could it be that the Founding Fathers forgot about this problem? Maybe there's something in the Constitution that might be relevant to what we're trying to do, assuming that they were behaving in good faith. And what would they have come up upon? Well, they would have come up upon the militia, execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, repel invasion. See, that sounds like a pretty good wish list for a Homeland Security type function. But they didn't, all right? And that just goes to show you, that was back in 1940, 1941. And how much more history have we lost, the understanding of history have we lost since then, right? And it's amazing now that when people look back look at our situation, they don't do a little bit of historical study, just going back to the Roosevelt period. And say, oh, here's an example of what those people didn't do when they had a first-class crisis on their hands, World War II, right? We should learn from that Number one, we don't appoint someone like Fiorello LaGuardia or Eleanor Roosevelt to solve the problem.
Right.
Pick someone who's got a little more competence. But we should learn from that. And the mistake those people made was they didn't look into the Constitution for the solution.
Mm-hmm.
The Constitution really contains all the solutions that we need. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And the importance of the militia in all of this is, well, the Founding Fathers were very suspicious of standing armies. They didn't like the concept of standing armies at all. And they were willing to set up a standing army for a 2-year period because Congress can raise and support armies, but the appropriations can only last 2 years. Why?
Right.
Because the House of Representatives turns over every 2 years, right? The People's House turns over every 2 years, and a House of Representatives that now had discovered that the standing army was a danger would say, well, no more appropriations. You're gone. You're not getting any more money, okay? So they put that in with that control, and everything else was left to the militia. The standing army is not given the power to execute the laws, suppress insurrections, or repel invasions, although you would think the standing army would repel invasions.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no specific provision in the Constitution for the standing army to do that. It's the militia that's given that authority explicitly, so that no one would make the mistake of thinking that the standing army was the only military or paramilitary or quasi-military force in the country to deal with those problems.
Mm-hmm.
It's like emphatically showing, wait a minute, the ultimate power is in the people themselves. It's not in this organization that we don't really trust, but we see that we might have a need for. And therefore, we'll put something in, an equivocal provision in the Constitution about this structure. And what have we done since then?
The exact opposite. Yep.
Yeah, we've just forgotten about it. This isn't important. This isn't important.
Well, the brilliance of our Constitution, the brilliance of our founding fathers in putting the government that we were intended to have together was that it was always intended to be controlled locally, and that the power would flow from the bottom up, not the top down. And that was in our military. It was in everything in our country. Local control was supposed to be the ultimate thing. And that's why it's so important that we fight back against these anti-gunners, I guess I'd have to call them, that are trying to destroy all of our Second Amendment rights, because they know that. They know that if they take away the ability to defend yourself, there's nothing more personal than that, is there?
Well, by hypothesis, no. I mean, William Blackstone, he wrote a book called Commentaries on the Laws of England. And this was the standard legal text during the Founding Fathers era. In fact, it probably sold more volumes than any other book other than the Bible in the colonies. And he makes the point that self-defense is the primary law of nature, and that no law of any government can remove that right. Right? And that's individual self-defense and community self-defense.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Second Amendment, although it obviously would protect the individual in protecting himself, its real goal is to protect the community by mobilizing and training and arming all the members of the community with that goal in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what these people, the ones who really understand it, are attempting to do to us. They're attempting to make it impossible for us to fulfill this constitutional duty. You know, the militia, historically, were not voluntary organizations.
Right.
They were compulsory organizations.
Compulsory, mandatory.
You became 16 years of age, 15 years of age in Massachusetts, or when you moved in to the jurisdiction, you had so many days to fulfill a laundry list of requirements. You had to come up with your gun, your ammunition, this, that, and the other thing, and then you were going to train, and you were going to assemble, and whatever. There's a whole list of things. You had no way out unless you were a conscientious objector, and then a conscientious objector didn't have to have a gun, but he still had to perform some other functions.
Right.
And in the colonial period, women were not required to perform the paramilitary functions, but they had financial functions to the militia.
Mm-hmm.
So a widow had a minor son under 21 years of age. That son, if the son was 16 or older, was in the militia. Where would he get his money to buy his gun? Because you had to buy your gun in the marketplace. It wasn't supplied to you by the government. These were your guns, not theirs. His mother had to supply the money. Or if she had a servant, a male servant, who was in the militia, he didn't have the money, She had to supply it. So they had financial duties as well. Now with the what's so-called legal emancipation of women, all women are going to serve to some extent in the militia. And if you read the statute of Virginia, again, coming back to Virginia, Virginia says all able-bodied residents of the Commonwealth, it doesn't specify men or women, it's all of them, have some responsibility. We'll figure out what that responsibility is depending on your age, your education, your physical abilities, and so your experience, whatever it is. We'll find some slot for you, right? If you're an anti-gun zealot, we'll give you a shovel. You know what I mean?
Or let you cook meals for the people who are there.
I'm not so sure about that. Give him a shovel, because he can dig holes and fill them in again, okay? Whatever. We'll find something for you to do, okay? And then you will be performing that community defense function. So when Katrina hits New Orleans, the dikes won't fail, the levees won't fail. You won't need to call in FEMA. You won't have police running around beating up little old women to take revolvers from them. All of which happened then, if one remembers that event.
Sure did.
Right? And that was because, I keep looking back to that and I say, my God, here's a city that's below sea level. If they had had a militia, which had the engineers and so forth that you would probably find in Louisiana, just as you'll find them anywhere else. If they had had a militia, do you think that those levees would have been left in a condition where they would have failed? Right? Probably not. Probably the people who live there would have been concerned enough about the state of security of their city. They had had hurricanes before, and they certainly had flooding in the city, right? They would have figured out some way to deal with that kind of an emergency, and not to be held hostage to the Corps of Engineers or to FEMA when it came in after the fact.
And they wouldn't be wrestling little old ladies to the floor so that they could take away her ability to defend herself from the looters that were all over New Orleans.
Yeah, and that was the first thing the chief of police said. We're not going to allow anyone to have a gun.
Yeah.
I thought to myself, what?
Yeah.
Even General Gage didn't do that. When General Gage went to Lexington and Concord, the idea was to collect the military stores, the cannon, the shot, sometimes the preserved food and so forth. He didn't send out Major Smith, Colonel Smith, and Major what was his name there, the other one there, the Marine, Pitcairn. He didn't send them out to confiscate every Patriot's rifle or musket. All right. So this guy in New Orleans, I can't remember his name. He's worse than General Gage.
Yeah.
Didn't nobody notice that in New Orleans? I mean, I can say he didn't notice it, but wasn't there somebody else might have tapped him on the shoulder and said, wait a minute, you know what you're doing here? Do you understand a little bit about American history? You really can't say that? No, they didn't.
And they sent people to jail for protecting their homes.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that happened in a lot of the neighborhoods there. They were actually going into the homes, and if they refused to give up their weapons, they'd throw them in jail.
Yeah, and eventually they had to pass a statute preventing that. Eventually. And that's the whole problem with this, you see. We are always in the position of coming from behind. Right? We're looking for the Hail Mary pass in the last few seconds of the fourth quarter. It's the other side that's always ahead of us on the scoreboard. That's our difficulty. If we were coming at this from the other direction, if we were coming at this from the direction of the first 13 words of the Second Amendment, by hypothesis, we'd be always in the forefront. Because once we had those institutions set up, well, the first principle is organization, but the next principle is organization around what? On armed citizenry. That's the end of gun control. That's the end of it. It goes away. I don't care how many billions Bloomberg has. There's no way that he can spend them in such a way as to overturn that provision of the Constitution where everyone is participating in the system.
Right.
Any more than he could spend those billions to overturn the Army of the United States.
Well, you can't vote away your rights.
No,
it takes an amendment to the Constitution. And what they've been trying to convince us is that if they throw enough initiatives and things at the system and get these things passed through by hook or crook, thank you, Steer, Bloomberg, Soros, and the rest of them, buying these initiatives and the necessary lies to go with it in the media, They managed to push that through. We've watched it here in Washington State. I mean, the drivel that they advertise over on the west side of the state, which has the population, which can many times push these issues because they convince the rest of the state we can't beat them. We can if we just get off our butts and vote. But it's been a mind game and a very well thought out process if you want to take a look at it. And you're right. I totally get what you're saying there, Dr. Vieira, that I lost my train of thought. Sorry.
Thumper, this is a good point. Let's put up, if you do it, put up Edwin's books. He's written a number of great books on the citizen militia, on the right to keep and bear arms, and this is a great point to put those up so that our listeners, if they're interested in learning more, and I hope they are, about our responsibility to a citizen militia, they can learn more from reading Dr. Vieira's books.
I can do that. Let me pull them up from the email here.
Edwin, you go ahead and give your response to what Thumper just said.
Well, let me put in this context. The whole gun control agenda is based on the proposition that they are the government and we are just individuals. And the government has the authority to regulate individuals. And then, of course, they don't talk about the specifics. But if we are members of the militia, we are part of the government. And one part of the government cannot attack another part of the government and prevent it from performing its function. So my response to Governor Northam in these situations, in banning assault firearms, if I had an assault firearm under their definition, I would say, well, you can't ban my possession of an assault firearm because I'm a member of the militia and I have to have this. All right? That's the sequence that I'm afraid that the pro-gun people don't realize, that the more they harp on the individual right, the more they play into this dichotomy between the government's power to regulate and the individual's, how shall I say, exposure to this power. Mm-hmm. And they lose that battle again and again. I mean, sometimes they win it in a minor sense, but you've seen these statutes that deal with assault firearms again and again being upheld by the courts all the way down the eastern seaboard. And I think the Colby case is a fascinating one because in the Colby case, the court said, oh, well, these AR-15s and AK-47 type firearms, they're akin to, they're very similar to the type of firearms that are used by regular armies. All right, AR-15 is a semi-automatic version of the M16 type rifle. And so they are essentially weapons of war, says the court. And because they are weapons of war, the Second Amendment doesn't protect them. It only protects weapons that individuals could use to protect themselves. Well, of course, if you read the whole Second Amendment, you read the Constitution, it's exactly the opposite. The Second Amendment is designed to make sure that the average American has in his possession a firearm that he could use in a military capacity. He could also use it for defending himself or his family. That's obvious. But the first goal is to be able to function in a military or paramilitary capacity. So they've turned this whole thing around. And once they say it's the government versus the individual, then the individual is always behind the eight ball because the whole proposition is that the government tends to have powers that can control the individual in various ways. And so we now have to come up with these convoluted theories of I have an individual right, this, that, blah, 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 all of which would be unnecessary if we were following the correct constitutional structure. Besides the fact that if we had the correct constitutional structure, a heck of a lot of things would be being done that aren't being done now outside of gun possession. Mm-hmm. Gun possession would be a relatively small part of all the things that the average militiaman would do in his locality. There are plenty of other problems to be solved. Right? Mm-hmm. But that's the reason that the gun control people really have a head start on us from the point of view of legal argument, is that they're coming at it, well, we represent the government.
Mm-hmm.
You just represent some people over here who are posing a threat to public safety. When in fact, it's the militia which is the foundation of public safety. It's the militia which is the most important part of the government because the Constitution, Second Amendment says it's necessary to the security of the free state. And we're throwing away all of these legal authorities that we could be using. And they are checkmate type moves because I said before, you can't use one part of the General Assembly of Virginia does not have the authority to interfere with the ability of the militia of the United States to function. It's as simple as that. One branch of the government cannot interfere with the exercise of another branch of the government's powers. So this whole thing would disappear like smoke being blown out the window. All right? And it's all because people simply don't understand the problem. And of course, they haven't been taught this.
Right.
I mean, imagine you've got a statute that says you're a member of the militia of the Commonwealth of Virginia, Code of Virginia, Section 44-1, from 16 years of age on up. Do you think any children of 16 years, 15 years, 14 years are being taught this in middle school or high school?
No.
In the Commonwealth of Virginia? Is it being pointed out to them? Oh, you have a responsibility here, statutory as well as constitutional. And why do you have that? Because you are part of the sovereignty. You are the ultimate government. It's not these people that you elect. They are simply your temporary representatives because it is too cumbersome for all of us to meet and make these decisions in a town hall fashion. But ultimately, you are the one that controls this government. You are the government. And this is one of the ways you manifest that, is by membership in the militia. Voting is another. Maybe running for office is another. Maybe petitioning the government is another. But the one that the Constitution says is necessary, the only one it says is necessary, is that one in the Second Amendment. Mm-hmm. Freedom of petition is not called necessary. Freedom of speech is not called necessary. Heaven knows freedom of the press is not called necessary, given the press that we have in this country. Right? Congress is not called necessary. The president is not called necessary. The Supreme Court is not called necessary. Why? Because we could do without all of those and still have sovereign government in the hands of the people themselves. Mm-hmm. All of the rest of that stuff is, as Marx would say, the superstructure. And if you look at the pyramid with the all-seeing eye in the top, right? Go to the back of the dollar bill. There's the pyramid with the all-seeing eye. And people look at that and say, oh, well, the all-seeing eye is where all the power is. Wrong. In a pyramid, the strength is at the bottom, not at the top. Bottom. You take the bottom away, the apex collapses. Right? Mm-hmm. And they fed us this line, these politicians and the Bloombergs of the world have fed us this propaganda line that it's exactly the opposite. Mm-hmm. We have no authority. We have no ability. We have to depend upon these elitists whom they elect through the spending of $2.5 million in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And now we have to fall down on our knees and worship them like a golden calf.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to use that as a perfect segue into talking about some of the court cases. We talked about how our education system is being destroyed and how teachers' unions, the structure of our education system now is in the control of the John Dewey mentality, the socialists, the progressives that are controlling our education. Talk about how that's happened, and I'd like you to mention some of the court cases that you were involved with the Supreme Court that went into those very areas.
Well, this has been going on for a long time because Dewey, of course, was active in the first half of the 20th century, first third of the 20th century. And his concept was that public education was going to be used to mold a new type of citizen, according to what his philosophy considered to be a correct type of citizen. All right. As opposed to doing what? As opposed to teaching the constitutional principles, social principles, cultural principles of this country as it had developed historically. All of a sudden, these so-called change agents, that's the phrase that they used later on, change agents, they were going to change things. What we had was not good enough for them. They had a different idea. They were going to change things. And no one asked them, wait a minute, you're changing what to what and why? Right? Tell us why this is advantageous. Well, the teachers' unions became the tip of the spear of this, especially after public sector collective bargaining was established in Wisconsin in the early 1960s. For a long time, you'd never had public sector collective bargaining where whatever was the group of public employees could unionize and then demand to meet with their public employer, whatever that agency was, and negotiate terms and conditions of employment. And that's a bad idea in itself because it shifts some sovereignty from governmental control from government agencies to essentially private parties. These public sector unions are not governmental agencies at all. And when those negotiations are going on, let's take a negotiation that might be going on dealing with education. So you'll have a teachers union negotiating with a school board over what? Terms and conditions of employment, which relates to how they're going to teach the students and maybe what the students are going to be taught. Who is not sitting at that negotiating table? Well, the students aren't. The parents aren't. The taxpayers aren't. Three other vitally important components of the system are not there. And then, if you see how this works politically, the unions are very clever in the sense that they will engage in political action to elect the members of that agency with whom they're negotiating. So they will be.
Yep. Thumper, did we lose sound?
I got it. Yeah.
Okay.
The union people will be sitting on one side, and the people they elected to office will be sitting on the other side. So out of this will come beautiful sweetheart contracts. One of the reasons, in fact, that municipal finance has been destroyed in this country in every major city that has powerful public sector unions. They voted themselves all sorts of benefits, especially wild pension benefits that could never be paid. And when the time came to pay them, they discovered, oh my gosh, we're on the verge of bankruptcy. Too bad for you. You shouldn't have engaged in this. In any event, National Education Association, to a lesser degree, American Federation of Teachers, NEA was pretty much outside of the big cities. AFT was strong in places like New York. They came in and they became the exclusive representatives for the teachers and the bargaining agents against the school boards or whatever the agency was that controlled the local schools. And if you looked into what these organizations were, and I had some litigation against both of them, NEA especially, and this was back in the 1970s, all right? So we're talking, what, 30 and 20, 50 years ago, half a century ago. I had one case where we spent a great deal of time digging into their internal records because the proposition was that this organization was or is a political action organization. That's a term of art used a lot in the Internal Revenue Code to deny organizations exemption, tax exemptions. Political action organization. And that means you engage in promoting candidates, you engage in propagandizing the public, you engage in lobbying. There's a whole list of things that you do that make you a political action organization. And the NEA was doing all of these things, and collective bargaining was something they added to their toolkit. It was another golf club they put in the bag, because it was a way to gain political access through negotiation and to use political influence, not only for their own members, but for their ultimate goal of propagandizing the students and therefore changing the attitudes of society. And they call, you read their documents at that time, change agent was almost on every page. We're change agents, we're changing, boom, boom, boom. And we're going to do all of these things through the political process. And one aspect of that was collective bargaining. So I had this case, eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the proposition was, you can't give this kind of an organization, this kind of authority over, in that particular case, junior college instructors. So we were at the higher level of education. You can't give them this kind of authority because they are using it for their own political purposes. And these people that they claim to represent who don't want to be represented are essentially being cannon fodder. They're using them to gain this position. And this is no different from forcing those people to accept the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or the Communist Party. They're all political action organizations. They just have different approaches to things. Well, this went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And if you read the opinion that came out, you would have no idea what was involved in the case. And I mean literally. You would have no idea. They didn't even have the gumption to admit what it was they were doing. You have to go to the archives and pull the original briefs and read those, including one that's about this thick, which contains the factual record in the case of all of this material. I had a witness by the name of Gordon Tullock, expert witness. Gordon Tullock and James Buchanan, way back in the 1960s, I guess, invented the theory of public choice, which is one of the more famous political science theories, which says essentially that you can analyze government action according to economic principles, that government actors, politicians, bureaucrats, whatever, do things in order to maximize their own benefit or the benefit of the special interest groups that are working through them, right? And that they really are not concerned with high-level political, philosophical principles or even constitutional principles. They're interested in this pragmatic goal of maximizing what they can get out of gaming the system. All right. So Tullock was one of the two people that invented this system, famous individual. And he was an expert witness. He read this huge amount of material coming out of the NEA's own archives. And he gets on the stand under oath and he says, "This is the best record of a political action organization I have ever seen." Goes to the Supreme Court, they pretend it wasn't even there. And at that point in time, that was the first time, while this case was going on, that was the first time that the NEA had ever endorsed a presidential candidate. Remember, they endorsed Jimmy Carter for president.
Jimmy Carter, yeah.
Jimmy Carter. And why was it? Well, it was exactly what Tullock was talking about. Mm-hmm. They made a quid pro quo with Carter. They would support Carter, and Carter would support a Department of Education. Not because the Department of Education is in the Constitution, not because the Department of Education would be good for the American people, but because it was something that the NEA wanted. All right? It's an economic driver in this system. Right? And Carter wanted the presidency. Right? And NEA had a large constituency, and they had a good record of turning out voters. Right? And so what happened? He was elected. They got the Department of Education. What did the Department of Education do? It has pretty much destroyed American education. All right? Now, we can go back. Let's not blame the NEA. Right? They're just people that are out for their own interest. We can go back and name those 9 people who were on the Supreme Court of the United States who did what they did in that case. Think about that. There were 9 people who allowed American education to be destroyed. Oh, and by the way, earlier I had another case called Abood versus Detroit Board of Education, in which we argued that these unions should not be allowed to force non-union members to pay them money for their representation. Mm-hmm. And we said in that case, if you allow this to happen, these unions will become so ensconced in this system that they will end up controlling the substantive negotiations. You'll have sweetheart contracts. You'll destroy the financial stability of municipal government. That was the argument that was made to those people. Didn't matter. Let them collect the money, no problem. Municipal finance was destroyed. Now, last year, there was a case by the name of Janus. I can't remember exactly what the education association was. Went to the Supreme Court. Because from the time of this Abood case, there had been people that were saying, no, we're not going to abide by that. We're going to fight that. We're going to keep bringing cases again and again and again to try and turn this over. Well, they finally did. Supreme Court gets this case called Janus. And in Janus, they say, oh, my gosh, everything we said in Abood was wrong. Mm-hmm. All right, we're changing that entirely. We're throwing this all out. You were right way back then. These unions cannot collect this money. Now, of course, what happened? 40 years passed. Municipal finance was destroyed, right? Could they change it? Well, they didn't change any of that. Could they have changed any of that? No. And this is an example of one of the problems we have. If the people are not on the ball, paying attention to what goes on, things like this occur, long-term consequences follow, and those consequences cannot be corrected. You got a lot of these municipalities that are going bankrupt. They can't pay these pension benefits that were negotiated over the years by these sweetheart arrangements. Mm-hmm. And who then pays for that? Well, it's the other person in the society who was never sitting at the bargaining table. It was the other person in society whom essentially the Supreme Court said, let them eat cake. Right? We're going to do this for the unions. We're going to do this for the National Education Association. That's why, in fact, that's why I think it happened. because the defendants in those cases, one was the American Federation of Teachers, and the other, even worse, the National Education Association. And they didn't dare to go against the National Education Association. And so they said that the case was about something it wasn't about, so that no one would know. And this isn't the only time. I mean, I've written about this in many other situations, right? This is one of the reasons why people have to have direct control of the system now. We cannot wait for the courts 2 years, 3 years, or in the case of Abood, 40 years to make the right decision. Because in that course of time, the decisions that have been made will necessarily have consequences. They're not made in a vacuum. They're not made for people who simply come to the Supreme Court and then disappear. That decision is then used, and that usually those decisions are then taken by lawyers and expanded on.
Right.
Lawyers are always looking for a way to game the system even more. And it's because the average person is sitting back and essentially saying, well, I don't have to worry about this. Somebody else is going to take care of it. I don't have to be a participant in my own government, not even in the militia, which the Constitution says I'm supposed to be. And that is a kiss of death to a Republican form of government. Right? Because the Republican form of government depends upon sovereignty in the people, and we're supposed to select our representatives, and then we're supposed to watch them. Right. To make sure that they are, in fact, representing us properly. We don't just give them this imprimatur of governmental authority to do whatever you want. That's what we have been doing, and look at the consequences.
Right. Well, it's like raising your kids, or like taking care of a garden. If you just throw the seed in the ground and you don't do anything else, it's not going to be a very good garden. And we've got that garden right now in our government.
Primarily weeds. Yeah, primarily weeds.
Yeah. And very little fruit. Well, I know too that something that you've talked about a lot, and I really feel strongly about, is how the teachers unions and all these government unions are now funneling large amounts of money into presidential and other campaigns. And they're not supposed to be able to do that, are they?
Well, they set up independent political action committees. That was the game. So that theoretically, the union and its political action committee are separate entities, and they don't commingle funds, and they're not supposed to commingle or put employees in both of them, et cetera. But the reality on the ground is maybe things don't work in quite that sanitary a fashion.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is that you have an interest group organized in a union that to a large extent is going to follow whatever the union political agenda is. Right? Once you get a large number of teachers dependent upon this union for their economic welfare, because it's their exclusive representative for collective bargaining, they will tend to follow the party line. And those people will tend to try to influence other people that they know. Right? Just kind of a natural leavening effect, if you will, through the whole dough. Right? Put a little bit of yeast in there and it's going to spread, because that yeast has a desire to spread. It's got an economic benefit coming to it if it can spread. Right? And of course, they are the ones who are organized. So if you have the NEA with whatever its different PACs are in different states, how do you contend against that politically? Well, you have to organize a lot of people. You have to create a PAC. You have to raise money. You have to hire propagandists and so forth and so on who know how to game Facebook and Twitter and other media, social media and so forth. You have to do all of that. Well, you're not organized initially to do that, right? You're just the average Joe. And so if you're talking about gun control as an example, well, what do? Well, you might maybe give some money to the NRA, or give some money to Gun Owners of America, some of these other pro-gun organizations, which other than the NRA are relatively small, right? But as Virginia shows, yeah, you can give money to the NRA, and Bloomberg shows up with $2.5 million. Right? He's almost 10 times more, 8 times more than the NRA spent. And so there you have it. And it'll be even more dangerous if Bloomberg runs for president, heaven forbid. Because there are no limits that a candidate has in terms of spending his own money on his own campaign.
Right.
Bloomberg could spend $1 billion if he wanted to. in addition to what the Democratic Party and so forth would raise, right? $1 billion only. No, wait a second. It's called independent expenditures. And think of that. This is like ancient Rome, when it was only the fabulously rich Pompey and Crassus and Julius Caesar and so forth who could stand for election and then become consul or whatever the highest offices. Eventually, Caesar attempts to become dictator. Right? Same situation. You know, the masses are there getting bread and circuses. They're not paying attention. The senatorial class, which is a small group of people, to a large extent patriots, they're kind of frozen out of the system. And then you have the very rich and powerful who are making the determinations. And the same type of... And when was that? That was what? More than 2,000 years ago. Right? That was like 50-something BC. Okay. So nothing has changed, as the Bible says. Under the sun, it's all the same, right? Vanity of vanities. It's all the same. Unless people, and there were those moments in history when people actually realize what's going on, and they say, we have to take a different approach to this. And when did that happen here? Between the late 1760s and 1800. That little window. And in one place in the world. Because something like that happened in France not too much later, and what did they end up with? Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yeah, well, they ended up with, communism or socialism that was promoting that. But, you know, your point is well taken, because in this day and age, with all the people who talk about how they believe in liberty, it is so hard to get any of them to put one nickel behind what they say they believe.
Well, it's more than one nickel. You know, I do a lot of things gratis. All right?
Yeah, me too.
I write stuff and I put it out, and other people, you know, put it on their blogs or whatever. No one is sending me a check to do that. Okay? And that in a sense is the American way. Think of all of the founding fathers who did what they did during the Revolutionary War period gratis. And in many instances, lost everything they had. Yeah, they started, on top of that.
Right. They started out wealthy men, and by the end of the revolution, they were broke. A lot of them didn't even have a home.
That's right. All right. And there's your difficulty. You have people today, all right, they're not willing to give some money. How about a little of your time? Right. Turn off Twitter, turn off Facebook, turn off whatever you're watching, right? And spend a little time doing this. That's time you're wasting now. It's not as if you're gaining income from being on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. You're wasting that time. And not only are you wasting your time, you're aiding the other side, because the more you spend doing that stupidity, the more they are chuckling there in New York City, saying, what a bunch of dumb klutzes we're facing here. No matter what we say, we always win because they're paying attention to the wrong things.
Right. Right. Yeah, they're looking at cartoons and pictures and all this garbage on Facebook instead of paying attention to what's really going on.
Well, just go to YouTube. I try to do this once a day for 5 minutes or so. Go to YouTube, click on YouTube, and see what it is they give you that they think you would be interested in looking at. Right. And it's usually some stupidity at the top. And then it goes down to what the stars are doing. Kim Kardashian is doing this, or some rapper is doing that, and on and on. And this is what I'm supposed to be interested in. Right? Well, the fact is, I don't then click on what Kim Kardashian is doing. Well, I go to something else. Well, it just amazes me to see that there are other people who do click on Kim Kardashian.
Right.
That's their life.
It wouldn't be there if they didn't.
That's right. That's right. That stuff would not be there on the YouTube page that they show me unless millions and millions of people were responding positively to the idiotic things that are being presented.
Yep.
Well, you can't have a free society populated with idiots.
Well,
that's obvious.
It's pretty obvious. We're losing our free society for that very reason, Edwin. The bottom line is they call their cadre that help them, that facilitate this, useful idiots, and they, so many of them consider us nothing more than ants or lice or any other form of non-existence. And it's because they get away with so much of the stuff. They're arrogant about it. They really believe they can do it. And they do.
Yeah, well, I think if you've been watching, as I have, for a long time now, remember, I was litigating those cases back in the 1970s and 1980s, right? Talking like ancient history here. My experience is to see how much they have, as the expression goes, come out of the closet. How much they are willing to expose of what they want to do and what they intend to do. It was all euphemisms back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And now it's a kind of in your face, we're going to do it, and there's nothing you can do to stop us.
Right.
And that's what happened in Virginia. They won that election, and they thought they could put out in what they call the pre-filed bills the most amazing, egregious, extreme gun control you could imagine. Mm-hmm. And they expected that there would be basically no reaction, maybe a little clucking in the background, right, little like that, but no reaction. And thank heaven there was a reaction. And now the question, not just in Virginia, Washington State, Colorado, I mean, you name it, this is where the reaction has to continue to occur.
Okay, a question for you there, and this is something that you may have some input on, and that is, what are the chances are that, I mean, we've seen some of the ballots that came out of Virginia there and several other states. There, the construction, the layout of the ballot was extremely, I mean, it was just weird. It's like troubling I've ever seen. And so the thought is, amongst the many people who are watching this outside of your state, are going, this is election fraud. This is election manipulation. Mm-hmm. And there's I think a lot of people, again, it would require litigation, going through the courts, blah, 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 blah. That takes time. In the meantime, these idiots who have been elected and are sitting up there writing all this crap are writing it with the with a lot of people thinking, oh, no, we've got to do all this. But, if they've won their positions through fraud, I would have to say, we're going to see a major rollback of everything that they've done, because they shouldn't have been there in the first place. It was all fraud.
That's right. Well, I think that's one thing that needs to be done all over the country, because election fraud is endemic. We know that on both sides, Republicans, Democrats do it. And I think there should be an extreme penalty for that. If you're caught engaged in election fraud, voting fraudulently, tallying the votes fraudulently, whatever it is, maybe you go to jail for 20 years. Right? The thing has to be stamped out, absolutely stamped out. And then the election has to be reheld. And if there's any connection between the candidate and the fraudulent activity, the candidate goes too.
Absolutely.
All right. No question about that, because you can't have a representative government where the mechanisms of representation are being manipulated by criminals. I think that's obvious.
Are you have you been tracking the number of so-called sealed indictments that have been racking up across the country for the past 2.5 years?
Well, I wouldn't have access to a sealed indictment by definition. It's sealed, okay? But what I find difficult to imagine, you know how many people there are in a grand jury typically? 20, 23 people, and then maybe a bunch of alternates. Mm-hmm. And they sit for maybe up to a year, 6 months to a year. If you had all these indictments, where are all the grand juries? Where are all the people that have been on these grand juries? Indictments don't come out of the prosecutor's office. Mm-hmm. I mean, he presents an indictment to a grand jury. He's got to put some evidence on of some kind, and then the grand jury makes a decision. So I just don't believe it. Not to mention the fact that some of the statutes of limitations in these questions are running out. Mm-hmm. The federal statute of limitations is generally 5 years, right? Think of some of the things that Hillary Clinton was doing when she was Secretary of State. Are we getting close to the 5-year period there? Is this all going to disappear because no matter how many thousand indictments come out against her, the statute of limitations has run?
Right.
I mean, if I were the president, if I had been Trump, the day after I was inaugurated, I would have started on the process of going to grand juries, right?
Yeah.
Right? And he didn't. He's wasted all of this time. And some people say, well, he'll do it when he's reelected because then he won't have anything to worry about. Really? You think they're not going to be trying to get him one way or another even after he's reelected?
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
There will be no limit to what they continue to do. Mm-hmm. So I don't believe that that's the case, especially now when you see who was the one that came out just the other day that Barr was talking about. Huber, or I can't remember his name, the one who was looking into the uranium.
Yeah, Huber.
Yeah, the one who was looking into the uranium problem, the one who was looking into the Clinton Foundation, and he said, I couldn't find anything that was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And Giuliani, DeGenova, who was representing a whistleblower who had the documentation dealing with that problem, DeGenova had said, well, this man didn't even want to talk to my witness.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't want to interview my witness. Well, what the heck kind of a prosecutor are you when you don't want to interview a witness that may make your case?
Well, right. and then they alluded to Durham is now the next man in line that is going to bring the sauce to the table, so to speak.
Oh, well, first it was Sessions.
Yeah.
And he recused himself. Oh, by the way, if he knew that he had to recuse himself, it was unethical to stay in that position.
Right.
Right. If I'm your lawyer, you come to me and I say, yeah, I'll be your lawyer. Oh, and by the way, I can't do it. I can't go after this because of my ethical, blah, blah, blah. But I'm still going to say you're a lawyer. Right. I'm not going to go to the court and say I should be relieved and you should get another lawyer. I got a problem. All right. First it was Sessions, and now it's Barr.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's these other two, well, at least Huber, and we don't know about the other one yet. Barr came out the other day and he said, well, it was just a series of coincidences that resulted in the Epstein problem. Just a series of coincidences. The cameras didn't work, or the tape has now been destroyed. The guards were asleep. The guards weren't making the rounds. This was. I mean, you wonder what kind of an East European Stalinist people's dictatorship you're living in, right? Because this is what they used to do. They used to bring somebody and he would confess that the man on the moon had told him to do something against the Communist Party, and they ship him off the gulag, right? You get all this information and you say, wait a minute, here was probably the highest, how shall I say, most important inmate in the criminal justice system in the United States, mm-hmm. Since Sacco and Vanzetti, whatever you pick out, who it was. Right. He's the most important man, right? Mm-hmm. If necessary, we need to put a company of Marines around him to make sure that nothing happens. Right? And maybe have a bunch of doctors, too, in case he might have a heart attack, right? We need to treat this man as if he is the most important thing in the universe. Is that what happened? No. Mm-hmm. And now they're saying, well, it was just a bunch of coincidences. Do they take us all for fools? The answer to that question is, of course they do.
Yes.
Of course they do.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing. It's amazing. They absolutely do. And the thing is, we keep letting them get away with it.
That's right. You say? And here we have it. You think if we had a proper militia structure in this country, with the president paying attention to that, being commander-in-chief, that his subordinates would be allowed to get away with this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. And that's why it is so essential for Americans to get off their butt and realize that nobody's going to bail them out on this one. We get it now. We do it. And the only way we're going to do it is if we participate, we get off our butts and do something, period.
It's Absolutely. Up to you and me and everybody else that wants to see this country preserved for whatever reason. Maybe it's economics, maybe it's politics, maybe it's whatever. We have to start acting. The other side has shown us what it intends to do. Mm-hmm. And it's shown us that it will expend whatever amount of resources is necessary to get that job done. Mm-hmm. And they are succeeding step mm-hmm. by step by step. And at some point, our back is going to be the wall. Mm-hmm. And then what happened? That's the thing we want to avoid. I mean, This was exactly the Founding Fathers' problem. They kept coming to their British brethren in Parliament. They petitioned even the king. And as the Declaration of Independence says, their petitions were met with reproofs, basically. No, we're not going to listen to you. All right. And they were pushed to the wall. And fortunately, things worked out for them. That's one of the few instances in history where it has. Mm-hmm. We don't want that to happen. We want this to be done within the constitutional system. But the only way the constitutional system is going to be enforced is through the people who are the sovereigns over the constitutional system.
Absolutely.
These other people are acting outside of and against the constitutional system, and they even tell us this.
Well, and Edwin, one of the things that it absolutely astounds me is that people think that somehow they're going to come out of the other end of this sausage maker, and they're going to have their cars and their money and their houses. Don't they understand what communism is all about? And that the whole idea is to take everything they have and give it to somebody else until we're all equally poor. That's exactly what they have in mind. And why in the world don't they spend the money now when they have the chance to do it?
We could just look back to that series of events. Mm-hmm. And there's the example of people. I mean, it isn't even a matter of brainwashing, right? Because there's nothing being washed out of their brains. The NEA and the others are putting things in there to begin with.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And then when these people come out eventually out of college or what have you, they're naturally neo-Marxists. They think in Marxist terms. They may not use the language of Stalin, Lenin, Brezhnev, or what have you, but they're thinking in those terms. And there's our problem. And as we said the other day when we were talking, Dan, to a large extent, this depends upon our generation and the one right after it, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. The ones who Hillary Clinton really meant when she said the deplorables.
Deplorables. Mm-hmm. That's
right. The ones who lived at a period of time when we weren't subject to brain control by the NEA, mm-hmm. right? Or at least we missed out on it in one way or another.
Right.
We're the ones that still remember these principles. And so it's our job as yeast, as it were, to spread that through the rest of society and get the loaf beginning to move. Mm-hmm. And I guess I hope we're doing some of it here.
Well, we are. This is the reason we do these radio programs. But, but at the same time, our outreach, what we're talking about, it's so important for people to get involved. They've got to get off their butt. They've got to do something. Now, Edwin, you and I have worked with James Yeager. You've been a producer of a number of important documentary movies about how important it is to protect ourselves and to promote our constitutional system. How, you've spent a large amount of money and an awful lot of your time doing that. I have too. And the point of all that is other people have to start waking up and doing a little of the heavy lifting themselves.
Well, maybe a little bit of the light lifting.
Yeah,
right? If we have enough people, the burden isn't going to be that great on any one of them.
Right. Well, lift their sorry ass off the chair would be a really good thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. And put down the beer and the potato chips and quit watching football and start listening to what we're talking about.
Right. Yeah. And start talking to other people.
Yeah.
About what you're going to do. Right? It's not enough simply to educate yourself. We got a lot of people out there educating about what we're talking about. But the next step is to put that knowledge into action. Mm-hmm. If you don't do that, it's been wasted. Mm-hmm. You can believe this and take it to the grave with you, but it will have no effect on straightening out this country.
Absolutely. Well, we're getting real close to being out of time here, but I do want to give you an opportunity to talk to our listeners and tell them about how they can learn more about you, where they can go to find out more about the work that you've done, and then maybe a few plugs for James Yeager and some of the films that you've been involved in, some of the things you've done there.
Oh, we've done quite a few Yeager presentations. Cultural Marxism is a good one to understand what's happening in this country from that perspective. Fiat money, dealing with the Federal Reserve System. I think that's a perennial issue because, of course, it's there, fouling up our economy. Good Guys with Guns is a recent one. Mm-hmm. He's done a couple to deal with the Second Amendment. So you can find those without much trouble. And they are presentations, not simply myself, but a whole bunch of other people that have been brought in who have a certain amount of expertise or interest in the subject. My books are on Amazon.com, where else. And if you go to News with Views, it's one word, newswithviews.com, I'm one of the, I'm in the author list. Click on that and you'll find, a very long compendium of articles that I've written to touch on these subjects and others, going all the way back to 2005, I think, when I started writing on there. So you can spend some time reading that. And what you will see coming out, I'm sure, as this Virginia thing begins to unfold, will be material that I'm putting out and getting to some of these pro-gun people. And I hope that they're going to be able to use it, especially if we end up getting involved in some kind of court case. Mm-hmm. Heaven knows I'll be involved in that.
Oh, you will. Yeah. Yeah. And I know, Edwin, you've been involved with the NRA in the past. I know you're disappointed with some of the things that have been going on, but you are probably the most important individual that I know in defending the constitutional militia. And I want you to mention Homeland Security and how you've written on that subject quite a bit.
Well, those are the main books that you're going to find on Amazon, other than the ones I've written on money in the Federal Reserve. Constitutional Homeland Security deals with the underlying proposition of how we're going to try to reorganize a militia structure in this country. 13 Words deals with, obviously, the first 13 words in the Constitution, in the Second Amendment, excuse me, and others. I mean, Three Rights deals with the relationship between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. By Tyranny Out of Necessity is one that deals with martial law. You hear all the time, we're going to have martial law in this country. Wrong. Martial law is unconstitutional completely. That book goes through it line by line of the Constitution, says I can't find martial law anywhere in the Constitution of the United States. Mm-hmm. And then Pieces of Eight is how shall I put it? It was exhausting to write. It's an exhaustive study of the Federal Reserve from a constitutional perspective. Mm-hmm. Goes way back in the history of American money and right up to when I finished the book, which was about 2000. Right. So that's a book, if you really want to get into the detail about the problems with our monetary system, that's it. But I will tell you right now, it's a complicated subject.
Yeah.
Oh, it is.
All right.
Not light reading.
We need to turn the airways over to Patrick Howley. But Edwin, thank you again. It's always a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Edwin.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution. Now an enemy from within would enslave us all again and deprive us of our rights in the Constitution. Restore the Republic. Wake up, it's time to understand. Restore the Republic. We're losing our freedom in the land.